There might be some who are shocked when I say that, showing respect for ethnic minorities, but I'm going to qualify it very carefully. The respect we must show for them is recognising that their ethnicities are their defining characteristics and are not to be deleted or overprinted with the words British citizen.
Our next speaker, I have to say, is a truly remarkable nationalist. I had the pleasure of visiting him over in Brussels when he represented the decent people of Britain against the dreaded European Union. He was an MEP and helped put British nationalism into the spotlight. We have seen him fighting our corner on television, against all odds and against the rotten media. Please welcome to Boadicea events, Andrew Brons.
Thanks. This is the least enviable position on the agenda. You've been sitting down listening to people for 4 hours, is it? And people have, of course, been terribly concise. And now you've got to listen to somebody else. Well, I will try to be as concise as I can. Now, the theme of this meeting is working together. And in my view, that's quite a profound statement, quite a profound description, because it's limited, it's realistic, and it's not excessively ambitious. Now, there used to be a collective desire for nationalist unity. That is, everybody, all ethno-nationalists in one umbrella organisation. Indeed, I've heard that called for on other occasions, and not all that long ago. But it has, of course, been achieved in the past. With the National Front in the 1970s and with the BNP in the first decade of this century. But of course that's not now. We're now hopelessly fragmented. So must there be a fresh call for nationalist unity that we must make yet again? Now, if that means all committed racial nationalists being in one organisation, the answer, I believe, must be a reluctant no. And I say that reluctantly, but I'm afraid of necessity. Now, there are those who engage in what I call political Tourette syndrome. Like, for example, the particular individual, I won't smear the whole organisation, but the particular individual who put the words of Thomas Mayer, the murderer of Joe Cox, on a website, apparently with approval. Likewise, the person who criticised the late German Führer, not for genocide, but for not committing genocide. Now, anybody or any organisation associating with either of those two individuals, and I do stress I'm talking about the particular individuals who said those things, is tantamount to saying to Amber Rudd, Home Secretary, please ban us, because that would be the result. Furthermore, if we're looking to seek an electable nationalist party, I think those who embrace undemocratic ideologies would not, or would find it very difficult to be able to seek votes in an ostensibly democratic election. Furthermore, those who say that there's no electoral route, and I have the greatest respect for people who say that, though I don't share it, those who say there's no electoral route to office and power have effectively precluded themselves from joining what seeks to be an electable nationalist party. At the other end of the nationalist spectrum, of course, those who embrace and really subscribe to civic nationalism, UKIP in other words, are, in the words of Nigel, who described the British, in the words of Nigel Farage, people who are legally resident in Britain and who pay their taxes. These people are simply not genuine nationalists and can be written out of the equation. In fact, we, unlike them, recognise that Afro-Asians will always be Afro-Asians and will never be British however long they're here. I'm not going to demonise them. I'm not going to say that they're all dreadful people, but they're not British. If civics see this as a terribly extreme opinion that would automatically prevent us ever from being elected, they might like to refer to a particular opinion poll that was carried out as recently as 2014. It was carried out by the respected organisation British Social Attitudes, and it asked people what they thought was the distinctive feature of Britishness. I'm sure there were some people who said British values and being resident here legally and all that sort of thing. But an interesting 51%, over half of those questioned, identified descent as the defining factor of Britishness. Descent, ancestry, their forebears. Now, that 51% was of all the people questioned, and that must have included a fair number of people from ethnic minorities. That 51% must have been a much higher percentage of indigenous British people. Now, I've said that I understand, but am sceptical of those who are sceptical and pessimistic about the electoral route to office and power. And I don't underestimate the difficulties of achieving that. However, in my view, there is no other route. A coup d'etat is not simply morally indefensible. You can't go around overtaking governments by force, but in fact it will be crushed in a nanosecond, the number of people we have available. Will there be a spontaneous uprising of the British people? Well, I think a spontaneous yawn or a spontaneous shrug of indifference might be more likely. Is the system going to collapse and simply leave a vacuum for us to walk into? I don't think so. So, however difficult the electoral route, that must be the route we must follow. Now, I have heard from those who say there's no electoral route that the establishment will not let us in. They would never allow us to take office. If you're talking about the politically committed establishment, then you're dead right. You know, Mr. Corbyn and Mrs. May and whoever's currently in charge of the Liberal Democrats, certainly they would pull out all stops to keep us out. But the establishment isn't restricted to the party political establishment. There's a much wider group of people who are not politically committed. And I think we've all come across these people from time to time. In the last parliamentary election I fought, not the European Parliament, but the British parliamentary election, I was on the platform with 4 others, the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrats. UKIP didn't bother to turn up. And they all walked off when they'd finished speaking to avoid having to listen to me. After I'd given my speech, the returning officer, who wasn't a councillor, he was a Lord Lieutenant or Sub-Lieutenant, made a point of coming up and shaking my hand. Now that wasn't because he agreed with me politically, I have no reason to think it was. He was simply distancing himself from their rudeness and their inappropriate behaviour. Now, these people, the non-political establishment, will probably view us with a degree of suspicion, and they'll really be looking at us very carefully to see whether or not we're people who could be allowed to take office, whether we respect the rights of our opponents, however much we might disagree with them, and whether we respect the institutions of the country. And my view is that any organisation that has been found to be glorifying the murder of an MP by a lunatic, or effectively recommending genocide, any organisation that does that would not only infuriate the political establishment, but it would infuriate that non-political establishment as well. Now, building an electable nationalist party, to do that we must show what I call the right kind of moderation, without being the wrong kind of moderation. I've never been accused of being a moderate before, so listen carefully. The right kind of moderation, in my view, is being careful in our choice of language, avoiding the N-word or equivalents, and avoiding making unsupported overstatements. So, you know, the recent spate of gun and knife crime, it would be quite wrong of us to imply that all or most Afro-Caribbeans are committing gun or knife crime, or even that all gun and knife crime is being committed by Afro-Caribbeans. But it is perfectly acceptable to speak the truth, which is that they are disproportionately involved in it. A wonderful word, that, disproportionately. It gets us off a lot of hooks, and it does show us as people who are careful about the facts. I think it's important for an electable nationalist party to show respect for procedures and institutions, and also respect for ethnic minorities. There might be some who are shocked when I say that, showing respect for ethnic minorities, but I'm going to qualify it very carefully. The respect we must show for them is recognising that their ethnicities are their defining characteristics and are not to be deleted or overprinted with the words British citizen. What the old parties do towards the ethnic minorities is the worst kind of disrespect. They treat their ethnicity, their background, their cultural and racial background as though it were unimportant, and that deleting it and overstating it with the words British citizen is being respectful. It isn't. It's treating them with utter contempt. Because these people of ethnic minorities who come to our country don't become new Britons or new Europeans. They remain what they always were. Now, I want to return to the theme of this meeting, working together. There is a paradox here. Whilst the nationalist movement is more fragmented than it has been for decades, possibly ever, one thing I have noticed, and I think this has been referred to before, is that there's much less animosity between individuals and organisations than there used to be. You know? And that is something that we can congratulate ourselves. There are many meetings of this kind where people from 6, 7, 8 different organisations, and many who are not members of any organisations, get on affably with each other. And that's something we must commend ourselves for. I could almost borrow a phrase from Christians who get on well with each other and have mutual respect. The word they use is ecumenical. And I think that racial nationalists, in a certain sort of way, have become much more ecumenical in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, this meeting's an example of that. John Tyndall Memorial meetings, another example. The British Renaissance, yet a third one, and various pan-nationalist meetings are yet again examples of this. And our relations, of course, don't have to simply be friendly. They can be cooperative, or at least what I would call complementary. I could, of course, refer to organisations that aren't themselves parties that might help an approved political party in their election campaigns. Jim and I have been beneficiaries of this in the past, haven't we? From people locally who are not members of our own party. But there's yet another way in which this can happen. And in my view, one war that needs to be fought in parallel with the political conflict that we're all involved in is what I call the war of ideas. Now, what is this? Well, the old parties don't simply differ from us on the basis of policies, you know, the immediate proposal for action. And indeed, policies are not simply freestanding proposals for government action. Policies are based on assumptions and beliefs, and those assumptions and beliefs are essential to policies, just as roots are essential to plants and trees. Those beliefs or assumptions are about humanity, different branches of humanity, and the world in general. Now, as far as this is concerned, there used to be what we called a nature-nurture debate. The nature-nurture debate was asking ourselves if we are as we are, or if the differences between us are attributable to heredity, our ancestral background, or our environment, and the extent to which differences between different races, different population groups, are attributable to heredity or are attributable to environment, culture, upbringing, nurture. Now, in terms of quantifiable factors, IQ in particular, this can be answered very easily by reference to the twin studies, you know, identical twins separated at birth and checking them. As far as quantifiable factors like IQ are concerned, then it's weighted in favour of heredity by something like 3 or 4 to 1, something like 70 or 80%. And that's a fact. The problem is, as the facts have mounted up, as we've seen more and more evidence showing that those differences are attributable to heredity rather than environment, they've been systematically denied. And then, after being systematically denied, have simply been ignored. So what we have now isn't a nature-nurture debate in which it's biased in favour of nurture. What we actually see today is a nurture-nurture debate in which nature is simply written out of it. And this applies with regard to different peoples, but it also applies to different individuals. As far as different peoples are concerned, if we look at why are parts of the world hungry and parts of the world like us not hungry, then we use the word deprivation. So we have deprived the third world of the riches that were their proper right. When it comes to individuals, why has an individual acted in this sort of way? Why do they have a criminal background? Well, they ask the question, what could have made the person? What was in their upbringing? The one thing they won't accept is there is a possibility that they were born that way. Now, how's this come about? Well, if we look for a distinct cause, we could go back to the turn of the 19th into the 20th century and look at the social anthropologists. One, Franz Boas, and his disciple, Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead came out with a famous quotation that's often quoted with approval. I'll quote it with disapproval. And she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that has." And she's quite right. The social anthropologists have indeed changed the world. They infiltrated the faculties of anthropology, that is, physical anthropology, and took them over. So that in every university throughout this country and throughout most developed countries, if somebody goes to read anthropology at university, they're in fact reading social anthropology. So they're not looking at the subject that dealt with the evolution of different types of human being, looking at human evolution. What they're looking at is an almost religious faith in nurturism. In other words, in the idea that people are the product of their upbringing. Now, this wasn't, Margaret Mead's conclusions on this were not the result of research and evidence, but the result of a gigantic assumption, and where it arose, the denial of that evidence. And frankly, Margaret Mead was not overstating her case, that they really have managed to influence not only the anthropology departments of every university, but every other department as well. Indeed, Jim surprised me today by saying that when he was at university, I think doing your first degree, that before he could start his archaeology course, he had to be indoctrinated with some social anthropology, just to make sure he didn't become heretical. They didn't succeed, did they, Jim? And because they've gained a right or been given a right to preach to everybody in every university. So I suspect that somebody going along to sign up to do nuclear physics will suddenly find that there's a module of social anthropology been latched onto it. Now, you might ask, what has all of this got to do with working together? Well, it's this area in which different strands of the nationalist movement might easily cooperate. We might share a single organisation, we might be doing the same thing in separate organisations, but this war of ideas can be fought collectively by all racial nationalists. Because the problem is that all of the political parties, and indeed the whole of academia, and even, well, public sector organisations, and even commercial organisations, you've only got to look at many television adverts these days and their promotion of multiracialism. They've been hijacked by the successors of these social anthropologists. So that what happens is that when public policy is made, or for that matter private policy is made, it's being made on false assumptions. So if, for example, we talk about immigration, we notice that there is a real problem that's facing the Western world. The real problem is the fact that birth rates have fallen and that people are living longer. People living longer a problem? Well, it does have attendant problems. The result of that is that the dependent population is getting larger and larger as a proportion, and that the working population is becoming smaller and smaller. So you might say, well, what's the answer to this? Well, one of the answers might be, they say, is to bring in people from fertile areas of the world, which happen to be the third world, and they will make up the difference. So we bring in a lot of people from the third world, and they become New Britons. Well, of course, if you accept the Franz Boas, Margaret Mead myth, that people are the result of the culture in which they currently live, you can do that. And the next generation will be as British as any of us here. Of course they won't. If you bring people in from the third world, you don't make them New Britons or New Europeans, you turn parts of Britain and the rest of Europe into the third world. Now, our campaign, run by possibly several organisations in harness or in parallel, must be multifaceted. It must, of course, include yesterday's vehicle for messages, ordinary leaflets. So apart from leaflets on concrete policies, we ought to be putting out leaflets on this ideological question. Are we the product of our heredity, or are we the product of our environment? And we know the answer to that. But it must also extend to websites, websites that will put people right. And it must even use social media. If you suspect that I don't really know what social media is, you're probably right. But I do know that it's important because I've been told so by my grandchildren. There might also be a targeting of particular individuals in the academic world, or possibly even in central government or local government administration. People who've been recognised as having a certain independence of mind and being open to challenges to received opinion. Now, so far, political battles, that's battles over policies and elections, have been fought against a backdrop that is not of our making. So in other words, we've fought by putting out our election material, but the problem is the assumptions of the society that we've been giving our leaflets to have been subject to drip, drip of propaganda, of nurturist propaganda, of the idea that people are simply the product of their upbringing and their culture. Only when we show that that isn't the case, and that that idea is false, will voting for us by large numbers of people become possible. Now, there will be some people who think talking about nurture-nature debates and all the rest of it is all a bit airy-fairy. Do we really have to worry about this? Why don't we deal with the concrete issues? Well, my view is that this is not far from reality, but it's the central reality. The thing that keeps all nationalists together, there might be things that keep us apart, you know, what our prescriptions are for the type of society we want in the future, or the type of state we want in the future. But the one thing that all racial nationalists have in common is we know that we are not the product simply of our culture, of our upbringing. We're, to a large extent, the product of our ancestry, of our background, of our genetics. And that truth must be emphasised and re-emphasised again and again and again. And we must not allow the present falsehood to prevail. The policy areas that it affects might include things like education, social services, crime and punishment. But the one policy area that's the true victim, and I use that word victim quite deliberately, is of course the area of immigration and ethnicity. Now I say, we know that in Europe and the rest of the wide world we've got falling birth rates, so the idea is we bring people in from the third world to make up for it. But as I say, what's seen to be a solution is in fact the real problem. And if you bring in young adults from the third world with high rates of fertility, then they turn parts of our country into the third world. Now, if the nurturist falsehood were true, then it might indeed be a cogent argument to do what they're doing, even if we disliked it on aesthetic grounds, if we didn't really appreciate the idea of bringing people in who were new Europeans but with interesting features and an enviable suntan. I used to say in the European Parliament that distinctive peoples are not the product of distinctive cultures. Distinctive cultures are ultimately the product of distinctive peoples. Now we in the nationalist movement must work together or in parallel, it doesn't really matter which we do, or possibly a combination of the two, to replace the establishment's falsehood with our truth. When we do that completely, then we cannot lose. Thank you.